Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We're going to wait just half a minute to give people a chance to log into Zoom, and then we'll get started. Thanks. All right, let's go. I think we have a critical mass and more folks will log in over the next couple minutes. So thank you all for joining us today at the Stimson Center. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with Stimson's Myanmar project. And today's webinar is going to explore the rapid developments over the past few years, especially in the past few months, in rare earth mining across northern Myanmar, especially in Kachin State. Some of you might have watched Stimson's Southeast Asia program's recent webinar, Where's the Water? Mekong Wet Season 2025, which discussed some of the environmental impacts of rare earth mining downstream in Thailand. So be sure to check out that webinar later for a really enriching discussion. And today's discussion is going to take a closer look at the Myanmar side of the issue, where the mining of rare earths has expanded significantly in recent years. So geological surveys of Myanmar reveal how rich the country is in a huge range of minerals like gold, zinc, gemstones, as well as the rare earth heavy and light metals, especially dysprosium and terbium, which are critical for the production of many modern technologies, from consumer goods like electric vehicles that are purchased all across the world to wind turbines and lasers. And because these rare earths are so valuable, the mines can be a very lucrative source of income for whomever controls them, which is an important factor to consider in Myanmar's fragmented economy amid the ongoing conflict between the military government, ethnic armed groups, and other non-state armed actors. And since late 2024, the Kachin Independence Army has seized control of key mining areas across Kachin State from a previous EAO, the NDAK. And as of late March or April of this year, trade of these rare earths has resumed between the KIA and China, where the vast majority of the world's rare earth processing capacity is located. So given the severe impacts of rare earth mining on local communities, as well as the downstream communities, both in other parts of Myanmar as well as in Thailand, the status quo of the mining operations really raises a lot of important questions about responsibility, sustainability, the regulation of these mines, and the impact on the people who live near them. So today, to explore this important issue in Myanmar, I'm really delighted to be joined by two experts on the externalities of rare earth mining, Ben Hardman and Pai Dietz. Ben is the Mekong Legal Director at Earth Rights International, and Pai is the Southeast Asia Program Regional Campaigns Director at International Rivers. Thank you so much for joining me today. So let's kick this off with the mining process, and then we'll zoom in on the industry in Myanmar. There are, as I said, significant deposits of rare earths across Myanmar, especially with these key elements like dysprosium in Kachin State in the northern part of the country. So Pai, could you give us an outline of the mining process and its kind of environmental impacts?
Would you like me to start or Ben first?
Oh, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, Ben, please go ahead with Kachin and I'll add on the lower part.
So would you like me to talk about the mining process or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So the mining process itself is not how I think people conventionally understand mining, where you dig large amounts of earth and move them around. It's more like a giant chemical reaction. It's called in situ leaching. So as a process, what happens is first of all, the areas that are identified are not done through any kind of extensive surveying or audit. It's simply investors finding areas where there seem to be high deposits, and then they start work because they think they can turn a profit, with no thoughts to, is this a sensible way of doing this? Is it efficient? Is it ecologically sound? But the process itself involves basically drilling holes in the ground and pouring in large amounts of chemicals such as ammonium nitrate. You are effectively starting a large chemical reaction within the hillside. And so that ammonium sulfate releases the dysprosium and terbium that are desired by the mining companies, but also everything else that is not required and certainly not desirable. So we're talking things like arsenic, lead, cadmium, all kinds of heavy metals, radioactive elements like strontium, lots of ionic salts. And so all of these get washed out of the hillside into streams and down through the watershed. And every time it rains, more and more of these heavy metals and other toxins are washed out into the waterways. I mean, we did some water testing with Kachin CSOs, and it did show very worryingly high levels of things like arsenic, lead, and cadmium, manganese. There hasn't been extensive testing yet. That simply wasn't possible when the area was under the control of the NDAK. But yeah, I think it's important to understand that this is not conventional mining, and it is extremely environmentally harmful.
Thanks, Ben. And I know that because of the difficulty of accessing these areas, it seems like a lot of the work has been done to assess where the mines are and track them over time through using like satellite images from Google Earth. And that there has been a huge increase in the number of mines across areas like Chipweem, Pangwa, over just the past few years since the start of the pandemic. So how does that reflect the demand for rare earths?
Yeah, so the demand for rare earths has radically increased, particularly dysprosium and terbium, which are primarily used in magnets. 94% of the world's dysprosium ends up in magnets. From 2020 to 2030, the US government estimated that the demand for these magnets would increase by around 200%, and then by another 100% by 2050. So what you're seeing over 30 years is a six-fold increase in demand for magnets that use these heavy rare earths. And so how that looks in Myanmar is that mining really started in the late 2010s. Prior to that, it was almost entirely conducted in China. And it began to move to Myanmar for two reasons. One was the extreme environmental harms that were happening in China, but also a desire of China to preserve its own natural resources and use those from other countries first, which seems perfectly sensible. And so a lot of the investors started moving from China into Myanmar in the late 2010s. By 2021, rare earth exports, this is official data from the Chinese government, were 19,500 tons. That's for the rare earth oxides. That had doubled to around 41, almost 42,000 by 2023. And so when we compare that to Chinese domestic quotas, as of 2023, the Chinese domestic quota was around 19,000. So basically half of the official imports from Myanmar. So by 2023, this was a $1.4 billion export industry from Myanmar into China, with Myanmar producing perhaps 2/3 of global supplies of dysprosium and terbium. By 2030, we expect, or again, the US government expects 1/3 of the demand for these magnets to be from wind turbines and 1/3 to be from electric vehicles.
So really, go ahead.
Just to add how that looks on the ground in Myanmar, 2022 Global Witness had 300 mining sites with roughly 2,700 mining pools. So these are the leaching pools that are associated with the mines. To just explain how those work, once you've collected what's coming out of the hillside through this leaching process, The mining process then involves adding acids to form a precipitate in these leaching pools. The sludge from those is collected, taken to kilns, and heated to remove all of the water. And so once that sludge has been turned into a powder, it's then exported to China. It's worth noting that that means a lot of exposure of workers to extremely harmful chemicals and the vapors that are released from this heating process to remove the water from the sludge that comes out of these leaching pools. So yeah, we're talking about roughly 2,700 of these leaching pools in 2022. It's worth noting that Global Witness told many of the companies at the end of supply chains about this problem at that time. By 2024, we were looking at around 400 mining sites in Kachin and roughly 6,000 of these pools.
Thank you, Ben. So really, the rare earths are just totally entangled in these supply chains. They're critical for the production of these new technologies across many sectors, and demand for those is only growing. And the impact on the communities where the mining sites are located is also proportionally growing. And so I'll turn to Pi to talk about some of the most basic environmental impacts that we're always going to see around these mining sites. Pi, could you tell us about what it is like to have a rare earth mining, a leaching pit in a community or nearby a community?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say that I'm presenting this wearing two hats. One is as an environmentalist working on the Mekong Basin for a long time, but the second one is just been newly affected by the rare earth mining upstream of our rivers in Kachin State of Myanmar, in eastern Myanmar. I would like to share some of the maps that I prepare. Please allow. Okay. So yeah, so our river, the Kok River, where it flowed from Kachin State to Chiang Mai, part of Chiang Mai and then Chiang Rai, used to be very crystal clear and like providing source of water and source of agricultural water for people in around 1.2 million people in two provinces, then flow to the Mekong River. But when we visit the area just early this year, the villagers in Chiang Rai, in Chiang Mai, in Taton district, told us that the river changed just recently. It's not clear anymore, but it's murky and unusually murky. And they heard that there are some kind of mining activities upstream in Myanmar, but the area is controlled by the United Wa State Army. That's impossible for them to get into the area. But however, they received some information from their relatives and from their friends and villagers across the river, the border. And then on March 14 this year, they organized this gathering calling Thai government, because most of them are Thai citizens, calling Thai government to do something with the Kok River. And lucky enough that we, so as a citizen, don't really have many tools, but when we looking at the Google Earth just upstream of the Kok River in Kachin State of Myanmar, we saw something like this, and we had no idea what it actually is, because we heard there are some gold mining along the river using the digging boat and all those activities. But when we file a complaint to the Thai, the House Committee on Land and Environment and other committees, we received this information that present to the Parliament Committee that just 3 years ago, nothing happened upstream of the Kok River. But just last year and in this year, we see clearly from the official satellite imagery of Thai government that there are more and more open area of the forest upstream of the Kok and the Sai River. And when we see the other bot satellite imagery, we saw something like this activity, not far, like less than 2 kilos from the Kok River mainstream. And when the Shan Human Rights Foundation released their report, and we saw this thing that pretty similar to what happened in Kachin State, but in Kachin State, upstream of the Kok River. I would say this is just a first page of this novel. So because this kind of site, just not more than 3 of them, and each of them already operate. And fisher folks downstream in the Kok and in the Mekong River, because the Kok flowing into the Mekong River in northern Thailand bordering Laos, they found recently in the past 6 months, they found this kind of diseased fish. This kind of catfish, they're small one and live on the riverbed. So anything happen to the river directly affects them. And we are so quite lucky that we have pretty good quality reports from the pollution control department that after we filed the complaint, after the issue was covered by Thai journalists and media outlets, they regularly test the water when it first entered the country from the Kok River in Chiang Mai, in Taton, and all the way through Chiang Rai City and to the Mekong River, as well as the Sai River and the Ruok River near the Golden Triangle. So the information gathered by the pollution control department revealed that there are serious heavy metal contamination in 4 rivers, Kok, Sai, Ruok, and the Mekong River on Thai-Lao border already. And this exceeds the safety standard by WHO. I think it's been very new thing for us. But people in Chiang Rai, along with the experts and the academics, work together, trying to gather information and try to reach out to any channel possible to stop all this mining, because we learned a lot from Kachin State that over 300 pits pool that release all the acid and the heavy metal and polluting all the rivers and the hills and the forest and the farmland, and we don't want to be second of that crisis. Also, as is already transboundary environmental crime, the Mekong River Commission conduct official tests or water tests on the Mekong River, and they just released the information last week. Pretty interesting. In the Mekong River, there are at least arsenic acid contamination along the border, Thai-Lao border downstream of the Golden Triangle, which means that the river is not healthy anymore. And in the conclusion of this brief report released by the Mekong River Commission, it says that this is the level of moderately serious situation on the Mekong River. And according to their guidelines, they issue 2 things. That one thing is to identify pollutant as arsenic, which is persistent, highly toxic, reduced biodiversity, accumulates in the food webs, and can pose long-term risks to ecosystem and, very important, human health. And the next one is to elevate arsenic concentration has extended into the territory of Laos already. So this is cross-border pollution ever happened to this area. And the latest news released today is that today the Thai cabinet just acknowledged the recommendation that made by the Thai National Human Rights Commission to protect human rights from cross-border pollution on the Kok and Sai and Ruok Mekong rivers, as the NHRC submit a letter and recommendation to the Thai cabinet early in June, and today the cabinet acknowledged this. And we really hope that this will be the first step for Thailand to take some action along with the Mekong River Commission. And I'm showing you this, the Mekong River below the Thailand in Laos, in northern Laos, because Thailand is now going to build another dam on the Mekong River mainstream. And this free flowing section of the river will be still water in the reservoir of Pak Bang Dam project, which will mean all this arsenic and heavy metal contamination will be clogged here in the still water. So how about the human health and about ecosystem of the Mekong River that's already damaged by the hydropower upstream in China? And all this is, I think, for us, or at least for me, I think this is the most complex advocacy that we have experienced because it's happened in the area there is no actual laws or regulation to control all those mining activities. They just do what they want and release whatever to our rivers. And so this is not acceptable at all. And we are seeking the way to make this regional environmental protection for not just for Thailand, but also cross-border to local areas in Kachin State in Myanmar and also to downstream Mekong countries. And we learn a lot from what happened in Kachin State.
Thank you so much, Pai. It's really sort of chilling to see how quickly these problems proliferate from rare earth mining within the span of just a few years as the operations expanded in Kachin State, as well as in Shan State. It's all across those areas of northern Myanmar where dysprosium and terbium can be found. But the impacts across the borders, wherever the water flows, is really critical. And as you know, the cross-border impacts can be so complex as well because parts of these areas are controlled along Myanmar's border by different EAOs. But previously, the NDAK was converted into one of the border guard forces since they were aligned with the junta in Myanmar, but now the KIA has control. And then there's the UWSA, the Wa State Army, which has de facto autonomy over its territory. So Thailand's ability to cooperate with whoever is on the other side of the border to combat this pollution and the impacts on the health of people upstream and downstream is really complicated by the fact that there isn't one group in charge. Could you tell us what is your perspective on that issue? Like, how can Thailand and Laos approach the issue when it's not the Myanmar junta that has control over these areas and the mining sites? It really is EAOs and then individual companies.
Yeah, what we learned is that most of these investors or operator of the mines are Chinese-speaking people. They could be Chinese citizen or holding Burmese ID card. We have no idea, but it is very important for the riparian or relevant government to act now and very immediately because the way that also the way that the upstream area is being the illegal mines site, then all this operation by people that without control were regulated mining operation and then export to China and use it for the goods or expensive products. I think it's just unfair. So we are trying. As I said, this is just the first few months of our advocacy, and we just realized that this happened upstream. Actually, we never look at the Google map beyond before. We just look at it in early this year. So this is quite new, but I think at least the way that the National Human Rights Commission filed this letter to the Thai government, Thai cabinet just today acknowledge it. I think it's already a very good step, but it is also important for us to also understand that those control the area is not actually comply with any other state or any laws. So how to control this damage. It could be diplomatic conversation or diplomatic procedures. It can be security procedures as well, right? Or economic sanction or whatever. I think if the governments really care about human health, we are now talking about impacts on human health and on environment. This is very important to take a step immediately. We cannot wait. And lessons from elsewhere in the world show us that ecological damage from rare earth mining like this might take up to 100 years to recover, and it is very expensive. And this is the waterway that we use for our water supply, for our irrigation, for our rice paddy, and this will go into the food chain and it will affect everyone.
So I have just another question for Ben, but I'll let the audience know. We're going to turn to audience Q&A very shortly. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them through the Q&A function. And if you're watching on the YouTube live stream, you can submit questions at stimson.org/questions. So then to kind of work off what Pi has discussed and sort of zoom in on the governance issues at the local level, what sort of governance problems are you seeing with these rare earth mining operations in northern Myanmar? Like what is lacking in a sustainable mining operation there?
Yeah, before I answer that, I'm going to answer some of the things that I want to talk about from the things that have popped up. One is we often hear these minerals, and particularly these magnets, described as critical, and they're often called critical minerals. And I think that's actually a little bit misleading, and we need to change the way we speak about that. It's a word I often use as well, but let's take wind turbines, for example, that are going to make up a third of this demand by 2030. You can design wind turbines in different ways. You can have what are called direct drive ones, which use just magnets. You can have geared ones that use no magnets, or you can have hybrid ones. Some companies like Vestas, Danish company, have done what they should be doing, which is human rights due diligence, and have redesigned their wind turbines over the last few years. And so they now use a hybrid design that reduces their rare earth consumption by 90%. Other companies such as Siemens, who are I believe, the largest offshore wind turbine manufacturer, haven't. They simply have ignored requests for dialogue from organizations like Global Witness when this was flagged back in 2022, haven't changed their designs, and are still using designs that have a magnet that weighs a ton approximately in each of their large wind turbines, and haven't made the attempts that Vestas has to reduce their use of rare earths. And so they're not critical, they're just sometimes preferable. And so companies like Siemens, because it's preferable, are using Kachin as a sacrifice zone. I think that's really important for us to remember. I think also looking at human rights due diligence, companies like Vestas that have done this now find themselves not dependent on very vulnerable supply chains, whereas other companies now find themselves at risk of being caught up in a trade war that sees their access to these magnets cut off. And so there's actually a link here between doing your human rights due diligence and what would be a good business decision not to be so vulnerable to such a fragile supply chain. Yeah, just to highlight that, as PPI said, and as the New York Times and Shannon Human Rights Foundation have reported, we're looking at just 2 or 3 mining sites that have caused these pretty serious harms in the Kok River. 3 sites. There's over 300, almost 400 in Myanmar. And then if we look at the area in southern Shan controlled by the UWSA, there's 2 mining areas that they control. This one that's causing the issues in the Kok River is the smaller one, 2 or 3 sites. There's a larger area further north in Shan State, which drains into both the Salween and into the Mekong. So again, we can expect to see, additional widespread transboundary pollution. Something else that I thought was interesting from the New York Times article was that it said that witnesses had reported that staff from a subsidiary of a Chinese state-owned enterprise, the China Rare Earth Group, were assisting. And so we know that Chinese companies, Chinese investment, Chinese operators bring all of the funding and the expertise that is necessary for rare earth mining across northern Myanmar. Most of those oxides go into China and are processed, we think, largely by the China Rare Earth Group. So when we're talking about diplomatic solutions, there's this perennial problem that the Chinese government says, we don't regulate companies operating outside of China. That's up to the countries in which they are operating. But that simply isn't tenable when you have Chinese investors and operators in Myanmar that has such weak rule of law and is so fragmented by conflict. So yeah, there's a massive diplomatic issue there. I think go back to your actual question. Yeah, EAO is it's quite a broad term. I mean, the UWSA is categorized as an EAO, but has no real pretense of accountability or transparency. I think most people wouldn't have categorized the NDAK as an EAO. It would be seen as a border guards force, as a militia that was effectively a proxy of the Myanmar military. And so we've seen this takeover of the rare earth mining areas in late 2024, shifting from the control of the Border Guards Force, the BGF, otherwise known as the NDAK, to the Kachin Independence Organization. And I think prior to that, Earthrights, our position was companies should be disengaging from these supply chains. I think it's a much more difficult situation now. I think we've seen examples of mines being stopped in KAO-controlled areas because of community protests. Kachin leaders have said they're going to be accountable and are stating they do have policies in place. The flip side is there's a real lack of transparency on these policies and on the revenues, because it's a $1.4 billion a year revenue stream, and also limited capacity within the KIO to monitor and enforce this mining, when all of the expertise and funding is really out of their control. So I think it's going to be a question of wait and see the extent to which the KIO acts differently. There was a great report by the Shannon Foundation. This is a Myanmar CSO that came out last year. It's on the Heinrich Boll Stiftung website for listeners. And it basically says that, within Kachin, the KIO is seen as a legitimate governance actor. And the international community ought to be engaging with it to increase its capacity and support it so that it can do things like more responsible mining. We've spoken to some companies that find that idea of engaging with Kachin civil society and with Kachin Independence Organization untenable, but I think that leaves them with a problem. If you look at OECD guidelines, they state that if your supply chain has a non-state armed actor in, you have to disengage from that supply chain. That is a prescription. It's not something optional. And so if companies consider they can't engage with the KIO, if governments consider they can't, then that means we should be not buying these magnets. The alternative is that you treat the KIO as a legitimate governance actor, and as part of your human rights due diligence, companies should be engaging with it, which isn't something new. The international community already engages with many of the EAOs. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights recommends that international humanitarian aid is channeled through some of these EAOs. So it's not a new or radical idea. It's the idea that if you are deciding to design your supply chain to include magnets, to include Myanmar rare earths, and companies we've spoken to say they wouldn't find it credible even if their manufacturers told them that their supply chains were free of Myanmar rare earths. Well, then if you're going to decide to use them, then you have to engage.
Thank you, Ben. That really touches on how complex the issue is, that it's extremely difficult in a situation like Myanmar, where control over the territory is very fragmented, especially in the border areas. And so ensuring that total supply chain due diligence from beginning to end is almost impossible in some cases, especially if you can't access the area very easily. And so I'll turn to a first question from Nikki Diamond, who asks, given Myanmar's large role and growing role in the global rare earth supply chains, what are the realistic pathways to ensure ethical sourcing, transparency, environmental accountability? You kind of touched on it, that there are sort of two options: to try to engage more, and then to disengage, follow that OECD guidance that it is a non-state armed actor. So what would you recommend in a case like this, where the demand for the rare earths is not decreasing? And I think that we can expect to see that there won't be sort of a spontaneous disengagement without a big change in how people think about rare earths. Like, as you say, thinking about them not as critical, but as the option we've chosen to use. What would you recommend?
I mean, I think it's up to companies to decide how they interpret those guidelines. If they do interpret the KIO as a non-state armed actor, then they should disengage. If they say, no, we don't think it fits within that categorization, it's a local governance authority that has legitimacy within Kachin, then they can choose to engage with it. Yeah, I think that companies need to be, as part of their human rights, and when we say it's impossible to do the human rights due diligence, it's not. It's impossible to trace the exact path of the rare earths through every single entity. But when you know that 2/3 of it is coming from Myanmar and it gets commingled in processing and in supply chains, you basically know that it's coming from Myanmar. So I'm not really sure what else companies need to do apart from to say, yes, we acknowledge that our supply chains are full of Myanmar rare earths. And so I think they should be doing what Vestas has done and redesigning as soon as possible. I think they should be speaking with civil society and organizations like the KIO about what remedy looks like and what they can do to help mitigate the impacts. And then I think for countries like Thailand that are starting to suffer these pretty horrendous impacts already, I think there's then a diplomatic engagement with both China and with stakeholders across the border, whether that's the KIO, whether it's the UWSA or the military junta. I think it's worth noting that the area on the border around the Kok River is not exclusive control of the UWSA. The area in the north of Wa State is the area in the south. From my understanding, there is military presence there with the SAC. And so there is some leverage there. And, Thailand provides the SAC with its largest source of revenue with gas revenues. It has a substantial amount of leverage in Myanmar.
Very true. And there is even room, I think, for Thai-China cooperation on this issue. As we've seen in recent months, there has been cooperation between the Chinese government and the Thai government cracking down on the scam centers because of the impact on Chinese nationals, both as victims of the scams and as people trafficked to operate the scams. And this is similarly an issue that will only grow in the cross-border human impacts. I wonder if I'll turn to Pi next. We have a question from Isabel Kane on the environmental harms, and she also asks whether these are like small-scale operations, who owns them. We've touched on that a little bit, but I wonder if you can address like how, I guess like what the impact is on the labor required for the mines in the local communities. And sort of the health of the miners as well as the folks who are downstream of the leaching.
Even though the mining sites are not far from the border, not more than in some other area, we can just use drone to fly on the hills and then see the mining pretty clearly. But we have limited access to those areas, so we have limited information about how the health how the health impact of those workers or labor have been. But we have heard a lot about the miners in Kachin State that some people just went there and work for a few months and come back and die at home without any testing because limited healthcare service over there up there in Kachin State. But and one thing I like to add on this is that most of these are just start, and even though this is just not more than second year of the operation of this mining, we already see the environmental impacts cross the border and already reach from more than 100 kilometers from Thai-Myanmar border all the way to the Mekong River already. So this is very large area of contamination and pollution that happening in this corner. One thing I like to talk about, I saw some of the chat, the question from the chat is that, how we should also mention about that this when the way that is called as a critical minerals, it means that this is very critical, very important. But actually, what could be more important than the water, clean water and air and land for us to live, right? So this is the way to greenwash these mining activities to be important, very critical, and other things is next. So it's like externalize other costs of the mining that have been very harmful for the environment, and also the way that is the all this mineral also used in defense sector, not just renewable energy or energy transition only. We see some information that pretty large portion of this mineral go to the uh, defense sector. And is that critical actually? And how come it is using this loophole of laws and regulation in this corner of the world to extract all this mineral to export for all those sectors that not accountable at all?
You make a really excellent point. It kind of follows on several questions that we have here about like who's investing in the mining operations and ultimately who is benefiting from the mining operations. Hajira Ahmed asks whether the revenues of the mines actually benefit the local communities, and if not, how could this be overcome to sort of compensate for the ecological impacts? And from what you have described, it really seems like there is almost no local benefit at all, if any. And it's just a negative impact on the communities and the land, and then the companies that mine the rare earths and ultimately turn them into the processed rare earths for these products are benefiting. Do you have more thoughts on the issues of like who benefits from the mining?
All those criminals, those who came and invest and take the whatever valuable for them and bring back to the third country, while the local population and the not just human but I would say the aquatic lives and rivers itself and the lands destroyed completely. Yeah, the and one thing we are developing to be the recommendation for the Thai government and representative government is that this is just the second year of the operation and the damage already very devastating. We need to categorize the no-go area, that even though it's called critical, even though it's very expensive, but it cannot compare it with our health at all. How could you do this like just two kilo away from the border, right? In case of the Masai River, the Sai River, which is also tributary of the Mekong, the mining right there in the water, in the river bed. And when is the flood happen, it's not just the water that already harmful, but also contaminate flood water. And this is rainy season already. People in Chiang Rai, Masai, and Chiang Mai, and northern Chiang Mai is pretty like have a little kind of anxiety that what would happen to us if the flood water happen again.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things to that in terms of the workers in communities. I think it's worth noting that most of the workers are migrant workers from outside the area where the mining is taking place. And so what you see is local communities lose their ability to carry out farming because of high levels of pollution. We've seen that Chinese importers of certain cash crops from Myanmar no longer accept those crops because of concerns over pollution from rare earth mining. In terms of the impacts on workers, some Myanmar CSOs we worked with spoke to various impacted people, including a Kachin pastor. And I'll quote from him. He said, "Miners became unwell. After working for 1 or 2 years, depending on their immunity, they start to experience poor health. They develop kidney diseases, respiratory issues. They suffer from headaches and sensations of being cold and feverish." I mean, we know that these kind of heavy metals lead to, cancer, cardiovascular problems, kidney damage, brain damage. I think for the most dangerous jobs, the ones where you're taking the sludge out of the pools or putting the sludge into the kilns, we've heard that workers expect to have maybe 6 months before they get fired because they're sick. We spoke to one one mother whose 15-year-old son came back from 3 months at the mine of gastrointestinal issues and then died. Gastrointestinal issues are a common symptom of arsenic poisoning. So we don't have a clear diagnosis, but there's that kind of circumstantial evidence there. And when it comes to who benefits, I mean, firstly, we benefit, right, with cheap EVs and wind turbines. I think that's worth remembering. I think that with the Border Guards Force, with the UWSA, I think there's very limited revenues or accountability. So revenues benefiting communities or accountability. It remains to be seen how the Kachin Independence Organization deals with these revenues. I think they are a very different type of organization to the ones previously in charge in Kachin.
Thank you. Those are all really important points. And I do think it is really critical to remember that those of us living in countries where these electronic goods are widely available, from electric cars to our phones, that we are benefiting directly from these supply chains just in our everyday lives. And we don't really think about where it comes from until we start seeing these reports. And thankfully, there has been a lot of reporting over the past few months on the impacts of the rare earth mining. But it really is, as Pai says, like we're just on the first page of the novel. There's going to be a lot of negative impacts that we have to hurry to correct. We have a really good question from Zaulot here, who asks if international companies withdraw from sourcing heavy rare earths from Myanmar, however they manage to do that, what alternative supply chains are available or possibly could be developed? Do you have any insight into sort of what the other options are?
This is a very short answer. There's none at the moment. I think companies are looking to invest and develop in them. Simply from a commercial perspective, they don't want to be vulnerable to supply chains as they are now, as we've seen from issues around sanctions and tariffs and restrictions on magnets. I mean, at the moment though, it's only China that really has the technology to process these rare earths. But certainly to answer another of the questions that I saw in the chat, there's no examples of this being done responsibly in Myanmar yet. The Kachin activists we've spoken to have say they don't know of a single mine site of the hundreds so far that has actually been remediated or restored. So I do think it's really important for companies to be redesigning to have much less reliance on rare earths. But then also I think there's this window where the KIO has to decide how much rare earth mining it wants to do, and so I think efforts need to be made to make sure it understands has information about the extent of the harms of rare earth mining and an ability to carry out testing that shows the extent of harms that have happened already.
Very true. And certainly there is a need for communities to be able to put more pressure on like the state actors that are involved. Like China could demand more transparency from its companies. It could require them to implement better labor practices at the mining sites at a total minimum. But there's really a lot of points in the supply chain where blind eyes are just being turned towards how the mining is actually conducted. And
there's some relatively, simple things that could be done. So, for example, numerous chemicals in these processes have been banned in China because they're so harmful, either to the environment or to the workers. So certain acids, for example, have been banned in this sector in China, but China continues to export them in large volumes, or allow export of them in large volumes to Myanmar. That wouldn't be hard to say. It's no longer allowed to export these into Myanmar. There's all kinds of things that could be done that would make a substantial change. The Chinese industry body is CCCMC as a set of guidelines that are very similar to the OECD guidelines. It would be relatively easy for those to be applied to any imports or any companies importing rare earths from Myanmar.
Yes, definitely. I think, we have a question from Nong Sing Ra, which is really important. You have explored some of the ways in which Thailand is already responding, but is there a plan that the Thai government has developed or that Thai civil society is developing to either engage with actors across the border to improve the situation with the mining, or other approaches to encourage the reduction of mining operations until these environmental issues can be properly addressed?
Being affected by this cross-border pollution from the rare earth mining and other kind of mining operation upstream, the only demand that the Thai civil society are asking now is to stop all this mine immediately. We know that this cannot be improved because there are Chinese speaking investors and operators. They know what to do, right? But it's more expensive if they do it within their own country. That's why they're using the loophole of the law and regulation and invest right here in the area where there's no such law. And we know that even though we demand for them to do better or to have the better safety of environmental safety or standards, it won't work because it will be expensive. It will be too expensive for them to do it. So the only demand is that stop this activity immediately and recover our rivers and our land. Because if we allow them to operate like this in the year 2, year 3, year 5, year 10, it will be impossible to recover the ecosystem services. It will be our river will turn to acid.
Very true. And you also remind me that in these areas of Kachin State, the local rivers are often tributaries of the Irrawaddy, Myanmar's largest river. So there will eventually be downstream effects within Myanmar outside of KIA-controlled territory, and then it really does become the Myanmar government, the junta's problem as well. So the situation will evolve very rapidly and have a lot of impact on tens of millions of people. We are coming to the end of the hour, so I will turn to, we have so many questions. My apologies, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll turn to a last couple questions. We have a really good question from Emily Fishbein about companies reducing the use of rare earths in wind turbines, other products. What raw materials can they use instead? And are there associated risks that you're aware of with those products, with those materials, Ben?
I think with the wind turbines, it's very simple. It's use of gears rather than just magnets. And using entirely gear designs, that's easier for onshore models because the gears require more servicing than the magnets. So for onshore designs, geared turbines are more straightforward. There are still some manufacturers that use magnets for onshore wind turbines. And then for offshore, as I mentioned, Vestas has reduced its use of rare earths by using gears and magnets together, reducing its magnet and therefore rare earth use by 90%. So for wind turbines, it's pretty straightforward. I think it's a complete failure of companies to do human rights due diligence and then to do something that actually means they comply with their obligations. I think if you're a company like Siemens and for years you've known this is happening because INJs like Club Witness have told you, I think you've moved along the line of accountability from being directly linked to these abuses to actively contributing. And so I think this should be a serious concern for companies like Siemens. I think for cars it's more complicated, and I'd be a little bit out of my depth to tell you about the technical differences between the different types of electric motors. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Thanks for shedding the light on the wind turbines, though. There are definitely solutions. The rare earth minerals do not have to be part of some of these products for sure. And there's clearly room for advances, innovations in products that do not require these rare earths that are so destructive to extract. And we have a really good question from Nantha Lynn as well. Can there be provenance-based campaigns on sourcing? Like how to make these materials more traceable, especially since the processing still happens in China, and we've all read about how Chinese companies can like attempt to source like recycled rare earths, which may be sort of run off from previous processing processes, but are not necessarily from like an end product being given a second life. But would a campaign on how to better source these materials help the situation? Or are we just doubling down on the use of rare earths? Hi, do you want to?
Yeah, I can respond briefly about this. I think what is expensive need to be expensive. It cannot be cheap at the cost of public health and environment and the natural resources. So I think the way that is made to be so cheap, export from Myanmar, from Kachin State, from Kachin State to China, then process and export to third countries or to the companies. The way is cheap because it's subsidized by our life, by millions of people's life, by the earth and by the natural resources and by the rivers, all this contamination. And I just mentioned about the heavy metal contamination in the rivers, but rare earth process also discharge the radioactivity too. And we still have limited research on that and the impacts on the environment and the health too.
Thank you. Ben, did you want to add anything to that?
I think responsible sourcing is tricky when at the moment there is no responsible source. But I think, and like we've had conversations with some of the companies that use these magnets, and I think sometimes we've been having to give them information about where these materials are coming from. You know, take a company like Volkswagen. It's got a turnover, I think, of something like 360 billion, which is 6 times the GDP of Myanmar. And so I think the companies have enough resources to establish where this rare earth is coming from. And again, when 2/3 of it is coming from Myanmar, and there's no real way to separate that out, I think responsible sourcing is, at the moment, we should just acknowledge that it's not possible.
Thank you. And as we come to the end of the hour now, I will start to wrap things up. We've heard so much today from Ben and Pai about the destructive industry that is rare earth mining, particularly in areas like northern Myanmar, where sort of fractured governance of the area makes it really difficult to ensure that mining practices are sustainable, especially when the mining practice itself is inherently harmful to the environment and the people who live there. And I also want to reiterate the importance of sort of raising awareness of these issues. I think that the large audience that we have today watching and the numerous questions, we've over 30 questions that we didn't get to by the audience, 30 questions and comments, speaks to how concerned people are about the issue. So I hope that over the next few months that this momentum will be maintained and that people can learn more about where the components of their electronic goods are coming from and do something to advocate for, I think, better policy in this area for sure. So Thank you, Ben and Pi, so much for joining us today. Thank you to our audience for so many really good questions and comments. I really appreciate your engagement on this issue.